Hey everybody, welcome back to the Looney Bin. My name is Looney, and today I want to talk to you about One Piece chapter 1153, because I like talking about the romantic themes of One Piece, right? I understand that maybe it's not the most well discussed and most well liked themes and topics of One Piece, but I like talking about it. And One Piece 1153 was essentially a chapter about the romance life of Harold. And it's important to talk about this because it showcases another pattern that Oda has shown consistently with a lot of these pairings that eventually became canon in the story. Most of these are flashback related, right? With a lot of these ships and canon pairings, but it's important to realize some of these patterns that he has done. And there are two patterns that he has done within this chapter that I want to discuss with you today. One of them being the fact that the pattern of a very similar dynamic between characters is a constant thing that he does with a lot of these pairings, specifically with like OdenxToki, with KumaxGinny, and even maybe if you are a Sabo Koala shipper, very similar dynamic. And the second is the talk about tragedy within these romances, because a lot of these romances with very similar dynamic wind up in some sort of tragedy that occurs. And I want to discuss with that briefly because it's a very interesting pattern, and there is a possibility that with how the story is moving along, that tragedy, that pattern of tragedy, that cycle will eventually be destroyed. And I'll explain how exactly. So let's first talk about the chapter and the romance of Harold. Now, the romance of Harold is simply a story about meeting a girl who he believes is being enslaved by humans, right? And part of it is that, you know, he's disgusted to see a fellow giant be used as like some sort of like circus act, and thinking that she's being forced to do this, when the reality was that after Harold destroyed, you know, the cage that she was in, and, you know, destroyed the town that the people lived in, she essentially smacked the living crap out of him, right? She punched him, she slapped him, and he's shocked because, you know, he's royalty. So, of course, he's shocked because why would someone just harm him? He's royalty. No one can harm him. But she does. And the reason being is that she wasn't captured. She wasn't enslaved by humans. She was there working. It was a job. The humans there saved her life. This person is named Ida. And Ida was just outright disgusted and just like angry at Harold for doing something because of a misunderstanding, because he did not know any better, right? And Harold is just shocked by this, right? But eventually these two characters, Harold and Ida, fall in love as they spend more time together. And it's interesting because Harold and Ida share a very similar dynamic to other pairings such as OdenxToki, KumaxGinny. Even Sabo Koala have a very similar dynamic, right? And it is a pattern that showcases how Oda views romance and like the type of romance he enjoys. A eccentric, brash character who's hard-headed, who goes out and, you know, causes mayhem, chaos, or just does things that may either put themselves in danger, put others in danger, or just maybe have a misunderstanding of sorts, right? And he pairs them with a female character who is strict, who showcases anger over those type of things with, you know, the male character. You know, hits them, slaps them in a slapstick comedy type of way, but is doing all this not because she's, you know, evil or like a bad person, but does this constantly to showcase that she cares. She cares in some form of way, and they're trying to put them, you know, in control. You know, calm them down, and show them that what they're doing is just out of line, right? They're grounding them, essentially. But despite all that, they have a sense of kindness. Their personalities are wonderful. They're kind people. They're beautiful people who want to help others. This type of dynamic is, again, a pattern that Oda has showcased. Harold and Ida fall in love, right? They want to get married, but then a curveball is thrown, a tragedy is thrown. They are not able to fall or get married, I should say, because the elders, the culture, the traditions of Elbaf forbids it, because Ida is not of, ancient giant blood or some sort of reason like that. And Harold is forced to marry somebody else. That is a tragedy. And more than likely, we'll see something else occur that will even garner much more tragedy from that, right? And he is forced to marry another person named Estrid, or Astrid, one of those names. I'm not exactly sure what is correct. I haven't seen the actual Raws or the Japanese version of it, so I can't really tell you which version it is, but let's, just say it's Estrid, right? And Estrid is essentially the complete opposite of what Ida is, right? Ida is a kind person, a very spirited person who showcases kindness to others. Estrid may at times showcase that, but also at the same time, she's very greedy. She wants to take the gold and the jewelry, and have it for herself. And the worst offense she did was literally when she gave birth to Loki and threw Loki out because she despised how he looked, his eyes. He was, according to her, a disgusting looking baby. Something that Ida doesn't showcase at all when she, gives birth to Hyrule. So it's like the complete opposite, right? Depending on how you view beauty, Ida may not be the most attractive person, to anybody compared to Estrid, right? But on the inside is the complete opposite. Estrid is beauty on the outside, but disgusting on the inside. Ida may not be, as attractive as Estrid on the outside, but on the inside is a beautiful soul that Harold falls in love with. And it's the age-old lesson that you probably heard as you grew up. It's not about the beauty on the outside, but the beauty on the inside, right? It's a common lesson that Oda is basically showcasing here. And it's true, no matter how beautiful someone is, whether it's your man crush or a female that you have a crush on, doesn't matter how attractive they are. If they are a shitty person, are you really going to fall in love with them? Are you really going to have a wonderful relationship if you know that they're really shitty people on the inside? More than likely not. You want to fall in love with someone who is very beautiful, who you view as your best friend, who you love all the quirks that they may have. That's what you want in a relationship, and that's the type of relationship that is more healthy. And it's the type of relationship that Harold and Ida have compared to Harold and Estrid, where it's mostly a marriage because of customs and traditions, right? But the important thing to note is that the love that Oda views as the positive one is a very similar dynamic that you see with a lot of older ships that Oda has showcased in flashbacks, and even a very similar dynamic that he shows with some of his characters currently, right? And it's important to know that as a pattern, there has to be a reason for it. It's because Oda views this as, a respectable romance, a romance that he thinks is a genuine one. And the reason why I want to talk to you about this as a pattern specifically, about this dynamic specifically, is because many Luffy Nami fans tend to gravitate towards that dynamic a lot. And for the most part, a lot of the ships that become canon in these flashbacks are of that dynamic that Luffy and Nami have, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Luffy and Nami are going to become canon. I'm not telling you that at all. But they resemble that pattern a lot. They resemble that dynamic. Very similar to how Sabo Koala resembled that dynamic as well. And it's like, we look at that and think, oh, so this is the type of relationship that Oda views as, a genuine relationship. So it's not out of the question that he views Luffy and Nami in that same way. If he decides to do a romance between them, it would fit with those dynamics. It would fit with the previous relationships. And that's why we love that. We love seeing that. We love to compare these ships together like that. And it really gives us confidence because it's something very similar and something that Oda really likes to showcase, and how a lot of these couples come together. And I know people have already have done this, where they say, well, Nami does that with Sanji. Yes, she does. But Zoro and Sanji are not necessarily have very similar dynamics to people like Harold, to people like Oden, because they're more in line with how Luffy is. He's eccentric, he's brash. Sometimes he's not, the smartest person in the world, but he goes out and does things that could hurt him, that could, essentially lead to him to danger and lead to others to danger. And then you have a strict but kind woman who settles him down, and uses slapstick comedy to do that, because she cares. She doesn't want to see them get hurt. With Zoro, he does do brash things, but he's not eccentric. He's very stoic. So he's not necessarily a good comparison to Harold, who is eccentric, who is brash. And with Sanji, he's also not, brash. He's not eccentric. Sometimes he thinks things through. He's very intelligent individual. Something that, a lot of these characters tend to be as well. But for the most part, they fit more of that eccentric, brash character. Some of them are a lot more intelligent than others, but it's more so toward and geared towards the way Luffy acts, right? And the reason why also is because, well, let's face it, a lot of these characters are kind of very similar to Luffy in the way they have like this main character syndrome towards their culture, towards their current story arc. With Harold, it's with Elbaf, people view him in very similar way that the Straw Hats view Luffy. Oden is viewed like that by Wano, the same way the Straw Hats and people Luffy has met view Luffy, and so on and so forth. It's very similar in that dynamic as well. So that's why it fits more Luffy Nami in that sense. But yeah, Luffy Nami fans like seeing this and use this as evidence because it's a constant thing that occurs. And if Oda decides to actually do romance, which I'm not saying he will, but there's always a strong possibility, he could. We could keep on going with this whole thing about, there's no romance between, the crew within the Straw Hats. But OdenxToki fell in love when they were on the crew, right? People constantly use that statement and then go ship Sanami or Robin, despite the fact that they're also crew members. So it really, it's not a good argument to make. He never even explicitly said that there was not going to be any romance between the crew. He just, literally the closest thing was, I don't think so. Which, if anyone knows the English language, means that he's not sure of yet, right? So who knows? Who knows if he does? I'm not saying he will. There's a strong possibility he does and he will not. We will see as we get closer. But it's really not difficult to see that he likes the dynamic that Luffy Nami has, and he showcases it through a lot of the actual canon pairings that he does in the story with flashbacks. And now I want to talk to you about the other part of this video, which is the tragedy, the patterns of tragedy. A lot of these romances that we have seen in the flashback that have very similar dynamics are surrounding by tragedy that occurs for one character, both characters in some sort of way. A great example, OdenxToki. Oden dies, Toki dies in very tragic ways, right? KumaxGinny. Ginny experiences tragedy when she is kidnapped and is forced to be a slave for the Celestial Dragons. She escapes, she dies. A tragedy befalls Kuma. Kuma becomes an android, a tragedy. All of these ships eventually have some sort of tragedy. With Harold, it's a tragedy that Harold was not able to marry Ida because of traditions and customs. Next chapter, we might see something that even increases that tragedy, even showcases more of that tragedy, because we don't know what happens to Ida. We don't see Ida at all in the story in the current time frame. So something must have happened to her, right? Especially with the way Hirudin just does not want to forgive Loki for what happened. Something must have occurred, right? Something must have happened. So we'll probably know more in the next chapter as the flashback continues, right? But a lot of these pairings, a lot of these ships end in some sort of tragedy. And one popular theme in One Piece is ending that cycle of tragedy, of blockade, of freedom in some sort of way, right? What's the possibility that Oda might break that cycle of tragedy of this dynamic and these romances by not having that tragedy happen to a pairing like Luffy Nami if he decides to do so. Something's gonna happen that could lead to a tragedy, but Luffy, being Luffy and ending these cycles of hatred, of enslavement and stuff like that, could finally end that cycle of romantic tragedy that occurs with similar dynamic ships like that. That is something that Oda could be leading up to, and if he decides to do so, he has a perfect pairing in Luffy Nami in a very similar dynamic that he could do so in that, right? It's all about ending that cycle of hatred, that cycle of tragedy, that cycle of one ruler or dictators and stuff like that, right? It's supposed to end with Luffy, those tragic cycles, and he might showcase that if he decides to do any sort of ship. I think Luffy Nami is the perfect one to do so, right? And we even have a situation in Elbaf where Gaban, when he meets Luffy Nami Zoro, he talks about love is freedom. Love is freedom, right? Think about how Harold was not able to marry Ida. Harold was forced to marry someone else. His freedom was blocked. His freedom to do what he wanted was blocked because of some sort of tragedy, because of the customs and traditions of Elbaf. That's part of his tragedy, that he was not able to marry and be with, Ida as his queen by his side. And Gaban talks about love is freedom. Like, yeah, being with the person without any sort of obstruction is freedom. That love, where you're able to love somebody without anyone telling you otherwise, without anyone trying to stop you, like how even KumaxGinny, like that freedom was blocked because Ginny was kidnapped, and Kuma not wanting to marry her simply just because he feared his own blood will be a curse to Ginny. It wouldn't make them happy. That is from the world government and stuff like that. That is freedom being blocked. That is love being blocked by something, by a tragedy. So it all seems to, it all seems to wind up in a way where Oda is going to break that cycle of that tragic love. There's not really any sort of pairing aside from within the Straw Hats that really fits that mold at all. Which is why Luffy Nami fits so well. The dynamic is similar. Something could occur with Nami can no longer, travel with the crew. Something's blocking, her. Something's blocking, literally Imu is likely blocking Luffy's freedom, becoming Pirate King and all that stuff. All of that seemed to connect straight to a possible arc or storyline that features Luffy Nami at the center. And that's why a lot of Luffy Nami fans are excited about this recent chapter, because it connects a lot of things. It connects patterns, dynamics, all this stuff together. The pattern of tragedy, the pattern of these dynamics, and that same dynamic falling in love, it's all connected. The parallels, you literally have Harold and Ida having a similar panel to OdenxToki. All of this is likely going to be connected to a story arc that Oda is going to tell us, right? Whether or not it's between Luffy and Nami, I do not know, but they fit the best to fit that storyline arc, to connect all of these and end this cycle. So that's why I think this chapter was very interesting in that regard. Let me know what you think in the comments below, right? I understand if you don't like Luffy Nami, that's perfectly fine, but at least acknowledge that maybe we might have something there, but you don't necessarily think it will still happen. That's perfectly fine. I fully understand that. But let me know what you think in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.